Hello, my name is Kristin Callahan, and I'm an associate professor of art and design at Lewis University. This year, we've all been thrown into a new and somewhat challenging teaching environment because of the COVID-19 pandemic. There have been many tools to learn and many things that we must consider that we may have never thought of in the past. I'd like to talk to you about something that I've actually been contemplating before the pandemic. But the current teaching and learning environment has really brought the issue to the forefront of my mind. And this issue is how are introverted students being supported in the in-person and virtual design classroom? In addition to teaching primarily graphic design, I also participate in a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion work on campus. This work has guided me to better understand my own biases. One of those biases that has been the most challenging for me is the preference for engaging with extroverted students. I would label myself as an introvert, even though I do have some extroverted tendencies. As an introvert teaching in higher ed, I find it challenging to engage with quieter students in class discussion. I find myself always falling back on engaging with those same gregarious, extroverted students over and over again because as an introvert, it's comfortable for me to sit back, listen, and absorb. In the virtual classroom, the introverted students have seemed to fade into the background. Being aware of my biases, I've, over the past 2 semesters, focused on developing ways of engaging these students and to reflect on how my own pedagogy can support the learning of both extroverted and introverted students. In this presentation, I would like to discuss how to support introverted students in the virtual design classroom. I'll reflect on the challenges they face in the digital environment and address strategies to engage them more comfortably in activities and collaboration. Additionally, I'll discuss the value that introverts bring to the design process. So first, I'd like to take you into the space in which I teach. I'm a design educator, teaching primarily in graphic design. The courses I teach range from technical studio courses to project-based collaborations. Students interact in these classes in a variety of ways. In the more technical classes, students learn techniques and theory that they then execute in individualized projects. Within these classes, they're expected to show their knowledge through a product. They work alone and are required to share their progress and present their work for in-class critique. Additionally, we address theory through lecture, class discussion, and in-class activities. The projects-based classes are meant to simulate real-world conditions. Students are placed into simulations where they have to solve design problems collaboratively, according to the goals and the objectives of clients. In these courses, students engage in class discussion and brainstorming. They participate in client presentations and are responsible for managing the course of the projects. Student participation looks different in these 2 types of classrooms. The technical studio course focuses on the individual. Classes are designed to promote the development of technical design skills and theoretical knowledge. The project-based ones, on the other hand, focus on the group. Students work collaboratively on projects to apply their design skills to the real-world problems, while working on soft skills such as communication, time management, collaboration, project and client management, and leadership. Student personality and cultural norms can affect the way that students interact in these 2 types of spaces. So to help us understand a bit, I'd like to discuss personality classifications and address how culture plays a part in how personality is expressed in the classroom. So first, I'd like to talk about the binary of introverted and extroverted personalities. These categories were first described by Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung. According to Jung, introverts focus their attention internally on their own thoughts and feelings, while extroverts, who were the opposite, focused externally on other people and the outside world. Like many binaries that describe people, many, even Jung, would argue that personality exists on a spectrum as well. Most individuals exhibit personalities that fall between the introverted and extroverted extremes. Introverts are typically described as shy and reserved and have difficulty adjusting to social situations. They're introspective. They take time in their decision-making to carefully weigh out options and explore different possibilities. And when they're stressed, they tend to withdraw from others into solitude. In contrast, extroverts are described as outgoing and responsive to others and can sometimes be seen as aggressive. They're quick to make decisions and find comfort in the company of others. Much of the work that I've been reading on introverts and extrovert typology relates to how personality types are stimulated or where they find their energy from. So introverts thrive in quiet spaces that allows them to focus inward and on their own personal thinking. They become drained with constant social engagement, but are energized by the times when they are alone or in deep conversation with trusted friends. Extroverts, on the other hand, thrive in community and constantly build off of the energy of others. So the lockdowns that we all have experienced during the pandemic brought this distinction to light for many of us. I remember a colleague of mine saying that the lockdowns were heaven because he was an introvert. Personally, I was drained by the situation because I felt like I had to be on all the time during remote interactions. And the pace required to shift teaching modalities didn't give me time to process and to reflect. So I'd like to share this quick little video with you that's sort of a funny take on the differences between introverted and extroverted people.
I don't know how I'm gonna do this. I need attention from others.
Welcome to my paradise.
Half marathon in a couple weeks, not happening. I have reservations for weeks. To top it all off, I was gonna go to the Carly Rae Jepsen concert. Call me maybe, call me later, I guess.
Only thing I have is sometime next few weeks I was gonna go to one of those coffee shops with a bunch of cats in it, but I'll stay here.
I'm gonna lose my mind. What are we doing tonight? We gotta think of something new. What do you want to do tonight?
Yeah, I was thinking I might just have like a me night.
What the heck is a me night? I'm the only person you've been around for like 3 weeks.
Yeah, and it's still too much.
So as you can see in that somewhat funny take on the different personalities, that there are extreme differences, and sometimes introverts and extroverts really don't understand each other. And honestly, they have a totally different way of interacting in the world. So Susan Cain talks about how our institutions are designed to support the stimulation needs of extroverts. She describes that there was a shift in preference in our culture from introverted to extroverted behaviors after the Industrial Revolution. Introverted behaviors of quiet contemplation and reflections were valued before this time. Americans that shifted from farming in rural parts of the country into cities to engage in big business required individuals to engage with new and different people every day. This type of socialization required extroverted behaviors. This has since become the dominant personality type in our society. So given the shift, we must consider that personality preference and dominance is culturally connected. In their book, Teaching Across Cultural Strengths, Chavez and Longerbeam call for educators to adopt a culturally balanced pedagogy. This consideration also includes how cultures define appropriate personality expression in learning environments and preferred learning methods. So their model of cultural framework for college teaching and learning categorizes cultures into integrated and individualized. Students from integrated cultures interpret the world in a highly contextualized manner. They focus on the interconnectivity of knowledge. This worldview places emphasis on the collective and assumes subjectivity within understanding and knowledge. The individualized learner, on the other hand, is one that compartmentalizes knowledge, focusing on the pieces before the whole. Cultures with this worldview emphasize the individual, self-sufficiency, and objective knowledge. So Chavez and Longerbeam discuss that cultures are normed around one of two ways of processing knowledge, internal and external. These two types of processing influence early childhood education and social and familial interactions. So first, in internal processing, which aligns with introverted personality types, need to gather their thoughts before engaging in conversation. External processing, which is related to extroverted personality types, need to engage in conversation to process their thoughts. For example, many Native American tribes would be considered internal processors, since they prefer more time to process and expect to be invited individually into conversation. Examples of external processors can be found in African American and Hispanic cultures that use storytelling as a way of connecting learning to community and personalized experience. Considering the range of experience, as Chavez and Longerbeam suggest, is something that designers do in the development of innovation. Designers look at the extremes of experience to gain insight into how to develop design solutions that not only work for those on the extremes, but improve the experience for all users. For example, many of the accessibility features that you find on your phone, like speech to text, not only benefit those that are differently abled, but they make it easier for the average user. I know I use that function constantly. Designing classroom experiences are the same. If you design for the extreme learners, everyone will benefit. For example, if you're building time into class for quiet reflection, these activities help introverts to have comfortable spaces to engage and process, while providing extroverts practice in slowing down. Balancing one's pedagogy to address the extremes of experience will benefit all students. An area to explore regarding the development of this type of pedagogy is universal design for learning, which is an educational framework that draws from the universal design methodology in architecture and industrial design, which focuses on designing environments, products, and communication to be used by all people without modification. Universal design for learners was once described by David Rose while he was working at the Center for Applied Technology. He said his colleagues suggested that UDL put the tag disabled where it belonged, on curriculum, not on the learner. The curriculum is disabled when it doesn't meet the needs of diverse learners. There are 3 principles to this framework. 1, present information in multiple ways. 2, differentiate the ways students express what they know. And 3, find a way to connect with students' interests and provide multiple methods of engaging with material. While many of us have been exploring how to make our classes more accessible for different types of learners, introverts may not have been on the top of faculty's minds with the rush to move to online. I also say this because there's been a big drive in higher education to develop collaborative, real-world experiences for students. Many institutions of higher education are promoting project-based work and community learning. While I believe this shift is positive because it allows for the development of interpersonal skills, opens conversation to multiple perspectives, and reflects more of a professional environment, it does pose challenges for introverted students and internal processors. These collaborative spaces are noisy and exhausting for introverted students who need time to process in lower stimulus environments. The high energy spaces that invigorate extroverts turn off introverts. In the in-person classroom, you'll find introverted students are the quiet ones in large groups. They tend to participate only when they really have something profound to say, or they're called upon. It's hard to tell if they're benefiting from the instruction because they don't overtly express it within the classroom environment. In the online environment, students can become almost invisible in synchronous sessions. They may leave their cameras off and hope to just fade into the grid of other avatars. I feel that the online meeting space could almost be louder than the classroom environment. It's easy for extroverted students to dominate conversation and difficult for quieter students to have their voices heard. One must be aggressive in the virtual environment in order to be heard. And so I saw this TikTok a few weeks ago and thought it was a perfect example. So let's take a look.
Well, that's not.
I don't have a mortgage either, so that's different.
We're not
Could be
really
different.
taking.
It could be, you know,
We're not
the
really,
whole sticky customer thing makes more sense for a mortgage because it's so long term.
Yeah, I mean these are metrics.
No, I think the deliverables it's
So
Yeah, we would try to use
Good
it.
explanation.
so kind of like we use
Yeah, we need to use data mining
But
basically.
I don't know. But if we want to
In our data mining, I think that we need to focus more on the customer specific data rather than the zip code. Because we want to really break down.
input no. So if it's empty, means no bank.
selling,
As you can see, that poor student couldn't say 2 words without being interrupted. It's in spaces like this where extroverts dominate. And just because they have the loudest voices doesn't mean they are the only ones that should be heard. I'd like to now share with you the ways that I've tried to engage introverted students in my 2 types of learning environments. First, I'll discuss my technical studio courses. As I mentioned before, these courses focus on the individual. This makes it easier to assess introverted students' progress in mastery of technical objectives, but can be sometimes difficult to assess theoretical knowledge that's typically expressed in class discussion and class critique. Like I said, introverted students would rather listen during class discussion than participate. Some of this is their need to process internally, and also part of their natural propensity to stay out of the spotlight. To connect to the universal design learning framework, I will use the first 2 principles to discuss my approaches. So 1, present information in multiple ways. So in studio classes, I presented material in a few different ways in the last 2 semesters. 1 was pre-recorded demonstrations and lectures. These allowed students to review the material at their own pace and review as needed. The second was synchronous class sessions that focused on student questions about material and small group work. Allowing time during synchronous sessions to address technical questions benefited all students, even though it was typically the extroverted ones that would raise these questions. Since the sessions were recorded, students had the opportunity to go back and review the session to help them better understand how we solved the technical problems in class. Those sessions also allowed me to model technical and aesthetic problem solving. As an example of small group work, there was an activity that we conducted in the typography class. We were learning about grids and layout design. Students were asked to view a lecture video that was pre-recorded. They were then asked individually to assess a piece of professional design work to identify how a grid was used in its underlying design. During the synchronous sessions, students were then put into small groups of 2 to 3 to discuss the designs and to evaluate them. They were then asked to share key ideas from the discussion in a larger group. So allowing time for the students to evaluate the work before class, give them all a point to start from during their small group discussions. It allowed introverted students the time to reflect on their own and gave extroverts time to collect and organize their thoughts in a meaningful way. Requiring the groups to report out also allowed the extroverts to engage in the community of the virtual room, while also allowing introverted students practice at their presentation skills. So finally, I found outside resources to share with students that addressed class concepts. Some of these were videos, some were interactive experiences and games. These other forms allowed students to engage with content in more dynamic ways and help them to provide and those items help provide lasting impressions. For example, again in the typography class, we played the kerning game, which asks players to adjust the spacing between letters to be visually equal. So each kerning challenge was scored, allowing students to test their ability and perceive spatial relationships, as well as make an impression about the importance of adjusting kerning pairs. So looking at the second principle, so differentiate the way that students express what they know. So given the nature of introverted students, I expected that they wouldn't actively participate in full class discussion and critique. Because of this, I developed a few strategies to allow them to engage more comfortably. The first way was to provide students with multiple modes of participation during synchronous sessions. I was using both Zoom and Blackboard Collaborate for these sessions. So students had the ability to speak during a discussion by raising their hands or by typing into the monitored chat box. The Raise the Hand feature in Zoom and Collaborate gave order to the discussion and ensured that all voices that wanted to speak could speak. Giving students the option to use the chat allowed them to be more deliberate in their thoughts and gave them time to reflect and respond. So I monitored the chats, but also asked one or two other students to help me during the session to keep an eye on it, so that no comment went unnoticed. So students that engaged in this way were then addressed directly, and they had the option to either respond in the chat or via voice if they felt comfortable. In addition to allowing for different modes of participation during synchronous classes, I also created asynchronous discussions that reflected the content presented and discussed synchronously. So discussions work really well for introverted students, since it allows them time and quiet space to reflect, so that they can be very deliberate in their responses. It was in these discussions that I was really able to gauge much of the learning of these students. Their interactions with each other were also really impressive and added a lot of value to the discussion. Another way that I allowed students to show their knowledge in different ways was through critique. Typically, critique and studio classes are done in one large group. Each student presents their work, and those in the class provide critique and suggestions for improving the designs. So critique is an area which I think many students need work. Much of the comments given during critique can be shallow and overly complimentary to mediocre designs. Students have a hard time criticizing each other's work, and they don't have enough design experience yet to really be able to assess design work and articulate the way that they feel about a design. It's because of these points that I think it's important to allow students to reflect. I provided students with the opportunity to reflect in a few different ways. The first was by pairing them together for checkpoint critiques. So over the course of a project, which may last 2 weeks to 4 weeks, students were met virtually on their own time with their partner to review the various stages of the design process. And so that can be anything from thumbnails to roughs to progress. So students were then were told to share their work in advance before they met virtually. This allowed them to reflect on the work before they came into the partner conversation. So doing that allowed those interactions to be much more beneficial. And this continual interaction over the 2 to 4 weeks then helped students to create a relationship and trust in the other person. Students expressed that they really enjoyed this experience, especially because during the lockdown, they weren't getting a lot of peer interaction. But they also liked it because there was someone who knew their project intimately and that provided them with thoughtful critique that really helped them to improve their work. In addition to partner critiques, I also utilized breakout groups of 3 to 4 students during final project critique. Students shared their work in small group discussions and talked about the design independent of the larger group and of me. I would then pop into each one of the groups and allow them to share their conversation with me. And then I would provide my own critique, modeling, design speak and analysis of design. So this was another method that students really enjoyed. One, because of the peer interaction, but I think also because they all had a voice. Whenever I popped into the classrooms, there was a lot of engagement happening, even in the students that I saw as being quiet and more reserved. And so I definitely saw and observed that engagement. I also observed that all students were participating in small group discussion, and they continued to participate with me once I entered the room. During these times, I was very deliberate in calling on each student by name to engage them into discussion. Using the smaller breakout sessions created a more intimate environment that made a world of difference for the more reserved and introverted students. Next, I'd like to talk to you about my collaborative project-based classes. These classes were very difficult for introverted students because of the nature of collaboration within professional design environments. So ideation typically happens in community. Participants are meant to build off of the ideas of others. These are great spaces for extroverted students, but what I typically saw happening is that the ideas were only coming from a few people. And those on the peripherals of the group, they weren't really engaging. But I realized that these individuals were not quiet because they were not engaged. They were quiet because it was difficult for them to process in the learning environment that I created for them. This revelation really became apparent to me when working on a project for the university's Student Center. The group of administrators that we were working with wanted to change our concept for an installation piece that we were developing. I brought the issue to the group and asked them to spitball some ideas on how we might convince them that our concept was really the best one. So everyone was struggling with this, and so we had to table the discussion until the next meeting. I asked students to just think about it until we got back and were able to pick up the conversation when we returned in 2 days. When we got back, one of my quietest and most introverted students raised her hand to share her idea first. This had never happened before. The student articulated the value of our conceptual direction in such a profound and well thought out way that filled in all our conceptual holes of our design solution and reinforced how it applied to the goals and objectives of the project. Because of her, and because of her reflection and synthesis of all of the things that we had been talking about in class, we were able to move forward with our conceptual direction. So I want to highlight this moment because it illustrates the way that introverts process is very beneficial to collaborative teams. So quiet voices have profound insight. So processing in a way that requires reflection, like introverts prefer, allows for creative revelation. Many of us have had experiences when it feels like the perfect idea just lands in our lap out of nowhere. We seem to have had an epiphany. But the reality of an epiphany, though, is that our consciousness has been working on the problem behind the scenes and putting ourselves in a quiet space and allows for deep connections to be made and helps spark these ideas that feel like they come out of nowhere. So I always have my best ideas in the shower and driving with no music on. So as educators, we need to value this. And we don't need to force introverted students to act like extroverted ones, because how they process is beneficial. So while I think it is good for introverts to practice engaging in a society dominated by extroverts, as designers, we must step out of our own experiences to embrace those of others and to empathize and understand the design problems we tackle. As design educators, we must also work with the same principle in mind, using the model of cultural framework of college teaching and learning and the universal design for teaching framework as a guide to help us understand the range of personality types and processing preferences in our classroom. This understanding helps us to design experiences that are balanced and equitable across this range. These considerations not only help introverted students and internally processing students to feel more comfortable in the classroom, it helps others to learn to hone beneficial creative skills. So the design process encourages input from diverse perspectives and challenges us to consider the range of human experience. The thoughtful nature of introverts allows them to synthesize information, enabling them to share feedback based on deep reflection. They don't merely react. They listen, process, and consider before speaking. Creating a space in the design classroom from all personalities can enhance the learning for all. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed my talk and you found some value in it.